The sun was setting behind the tall, dark trees of Pinewood Forest, casting long shadows on the ground. For friends, Samantha, Mark, Lisa, and Jake had decided to go on a camping trip to escape their stressful city lives. They had heard rumors about Pinewood Forest, but none of them believed in ghost stories. "Let's set up camp here," said Mark, pointing to a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. The group agreed and started pitching their tents. As the sun disappeared completely, the forest was swallowed by darkness. The only light came from their small campfire, casting eerie shadows around them. Samantha shivered, though the night was warm. "This place gives me the creeps," she whispered to Lisa, her best friend since childhood. "Don't be silly, Sam. It's just a forest," Elisa replied, though her voice wavered slightly. Jake, always the jokester, tried to lighten the mood. "Maybe we'll see Bigfoot tonight." He laughed, but no one joined in. The silence of the forest was oppressive, pressing in on them from all sides. They sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. Mark, the leader of the group, decided to share a local legend he'd heard. "Did you know this forest is haunted?" he began, his voice low and serious. "They say there's a spirit that roams these woods, a woman who lost her way and was never found. They call her the Lost Lady. She lures people deeper into the forest, and they disappear, just like she did." Samantha's eyes widened. "That's just a story, right?" Mark shrugged. Who knows? But they say if you hear her crying, you should run the other way. If you see her, it's already too late." A cold wind blew through the trees, making the fire flicker. Samantha swore she heard a faint sobbing sound, but she shook her head. It was just her imagination. It had to be. After a few more hours of uneasy laughter and ghost stories, the friends decided to call it a night. They retreated to their tents, but sleep didn't come easily. The sounds of the forest were different at night, more sinister. Samantha tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching them. She finally drifted off, only to be awakened by a blood-curdling scream. She sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. "Did you hear that?" she whispered urgently to Lisa, who was sleeping next to her. Lisa nodded, her eyes wide with fear. It sounded like Mark. They rushed out of their tent to find Jake and Mark standing by the campfire, their faces pale. What happened?" Samantha demanded. Mark pointed towards the trees. "I saw someone, standing there. It looked like a woman." Jake nodded. As she was crying. "I thought it was just another camper, but then she disappeared. Just vanished into thin air." A shiver ran down Samantha's spine. "The Lost Lady," as she whispered. They decided to stay together for the rest of the night, huddled around the fire for warmth and comfort. But the forest seemed to close in on them, the trees whispering secrets in the dark. The next morning, the group was exhausted but determined to continue their trip. They packed up their camp and decided to hike deeper into the forest, hoping to find a more open area to set up camp. As they walked, the trees grew thicker, and the path became harder to follow. The sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, casting an eerie twilight over the forest floor. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. "Are we sure this is a good idea?" Samantha asked, her voice trembling. "We'll be fine," Mark assured her. "We just need to find a good spot." Hours passed, and they found themselves in an unfamiliar part of the forest. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to grab them. The path they had been following was gone, swallowed by the underbrush. "We're lost," Elisa said, panic rising in her voice. "And no, we're not," Mark insisted. "We just need to keep moving." But as they walked, the forest seemed to change around them. Paths appeared and disappeared, leading them in circles. The shadows grew longer, and the air grew colder. Just as they were about to give up hope, they stumbled upon a small, dilapidated cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it was a welcome sight in the endless forest. Let's check it out," Jake suggested, eager to find shelter. They approached the cabin cautiously, the wooden steps creaking under their weight. The door swung open with a loud creak, revealing a dusty interior. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust. "This place is creepy," Elisa said, wrinkling her nose. But it's shelter," Mark said. "We can stay here for the night and figure out our next move in the morning." They set up a small fire in the cabin's fireplace and sat around it, trying to shake off the cold that had settled into their bones. As they warmed themselves, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Samantha wandered around the cabin, her curiosity getting the better of her. She found an old journal on a dusty shelf and began to read. "Guys, listen to this," as she called out, her voice trembling. "It's a journal from someone who stayed here before us. They talk about hearing crying at night and seeing a woman in the woods." Mark frowned. "Sounds like they had the same experience we did." But there's more," as Samantha continued. "They said the woman tried to lead them deeper into the forest. They followed her, thinking she needed help, but they never found her. And they never made it out." A chill ran through the group as they realized the gravity of their situation. They were trapped in the same nightmare. That night, they took turns keeping watch, but it was no use. The eerie feeling of being watched persisted, and the sounds of the forest grew louder and more menacing. Around midnight, Samantha heard it again, the faint sound of crying. She woke the others, and they listened in silence, the sobbing growing louder and more desperate. "We can't just ignore it," Jake said. "What if someone really needs our help?" "Or it could be a trap," Mark countered. "Remember the journal." But the crying continued, tugging at their hearts. Against their better judgment, they decided to follow the sound. Armed with flashlights and sticks, they ventured into the darkness. The crying led them deeper and deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around them. The path was treacherous, and they stumbled over roots and rocks. Suddenly, the crying stopped. They found themselves in a small clearing, the moonlight casting an eerie glow on the scene. There, standing in the center, was a woman in a tattered white dress. Her hair was long and matted, and her eyes were hollow and empty. Who are you?" Mark called out, his voice shaking. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she turned and began to walk away, her figure fading into the shadows. Wait!" Jake shouted, but it was too late. She was gone. The group returned to the cabin, their minds racing with fear and confusion. They couldn't understand what was happening or why they were being targeted. Over the next few days, their situation grew worse. The forest seemed to come alive, playing tricks on their minds. They heard whispers in the wind, saw shadows moving just out of sight, and felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Food and water were running low, and their nerves were frayed. They argued constantly, blaming each other for their predicament. "We need to find a way out of here," Elisa said, her voice desperate. "We can't stay here forever." But which way do we go?" Mark asked. We've tried every path, and they all lead us back here." We have to keep trying," as Samantha insisted. "We can't give up." But the forest had other plans. It seemed to shift and change, leading them in circles and deeper into its depths. They were trapped, and there was no way out. As the days turned into weeks, the group grew weaker and more desperate. They had lost all sense of time and direction, and their hope was fading. One night, as they huddled together for warmth, they heard the crying again. This time, it was closer and more urgent. They knew they had to follow it, even if it meant their doom. They ventured into the forest once more, the crying leading them to a hidden path they hadn't seen before. The trees parted, revealing a small, ancient-looking shrine. The woman in white stood before it, her back to them. Why are you doing this to us?"
Samantha cried out, her voice breaking.
The woman turned, her hollow eyes locking onto Samantha's. "I was lost, just like you," as she whispered. "I wandered these woods, searching for a way out, but there is none. Now I am bound to this place, and so are you." The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. They were trapped in a never-ending cycle, just like the woman before them. The forest would never let them go. Despair washed over them as they realized the truth. They would never escape Pinewood Forest. With no other options, the group returned to the cabin, their spirits broken. They knew their fate was sealed, and there was nothing they could do to change it. As the days passed, they grew weaker and more resigned to their fate. The forest continued to torment them, but they no longer had the strength to fight back. One by one, they succumbed to the forest's grip. Mark was the first to go, followed by Jake and Lisa. Samantha was the last, her body and mind broken by the relentless horror. In the end, they became part of the legend of Pinewood Forest, their souls trapped forever in the dark, twisted woods. The lost lady had claimed them, just as she had claimed countless others before them. And so the forest remained, a silent witness to the countless lives it had consumed. The legend of the lost lady lived on, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurks in the heart of Pinewood Forest. Years later, another group of friends decided to go camping in Pinewood Forest. They had heard the rumors but dismissed them as mere stories. As they set up camp and sat around the fire, one of them began to tell the tale of the lost lady. They laughed and joked, unaware of the eyes watching them from the shadows. The forest waited, patient and hungry. The cycle would begin again, and the legend of the lost lady would claim more souls. The forest never forgets, and it never lets go. And so the chilling tale of Pinewood Forest continued, a never-ending nightmare for those who dared to enter its depths.